Welcome, my family. Before we jump in, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. I'd also love to know, where are you watching from and what time is it there? Please hype me on YouTube. Thanks. I had dreamed of living alone for as long as I could remember, but when the moment finally arrived, I wasn't entirely sure what I had signed up for. In the summer of 2019, I moved into my first townhouse in Briarwood, New Jersey. I had spent months scouring listings, balancing what I could afford with what felt like home, and finally, this two-story place, tiny backyard, narrow basement, creaky stairs and all, felt right. My parents had 3 kids, and growing up in a chaotic, bustling household had its charm. But it left me craving quiet, solitude, a space that belonged only to me. I was 32, a freelance writer, and for the first time, the world was entirely mine to organize. The house came mostly empty, except for the furniture the previous owners had left behind. Most of it was easy to overlook, but there was one item I instantly disliked: a dark, ornate rocking chair in the corner of the basement. Dusty, faintly musty, its presence unnerved me in a way I couldn't explain. I didn't know why. Maybe it was its age, the way the wood creaked even when untouched, or the faint curl of the cushions that seemed to lean toward you, waiting. I wanted to move it, hide it, or maybe burn it. Anything but acknowledge it. Moving in was exhausting. Boxes stacked in every corner, Milo, my gray tabby cat, hiding under furniture, and the July humidity making every step a chore. That first night I needed my toolkit from the basement, so I descended the narrow stairs, flashlight in hand. The chair had shifted, just slightly, maybe 2 inches. I laughed nervously at myself. "You're tired, Clara," I whispered. But the pit in my stomach didn't disappear. The first week passed with small, inexplicable events. A pen here, a book there, objects subtly displaced. Doors I was certain I had locked were left ajar. The floorboards creaked in patterns that didn't match the house's rhythm, and Milo began hissing at empty spaces, fur on end, muscles taut, following noises I couldn't hear. One night I was at my desk when something in the corner of my eye caught a shadow gliding past the basement window. My phone had no signal in that corner, so I couldn't even text anyone. My heart hammered. "It's nothing," I told myself over and over, but nothing in my body believed it. By the second week, the unease was almost unbearable. I called Mr. Howard, my retired neighbor, for advice. "Old houses," he said with a shrug, wiping grease from his hands, "have their quirks. Don't let your imagination run wild." I thanked him politely, but his words barely touched my anxiety. Something was in my house, or something was attached to it. Watching, waiting. The question wasn't if, it was how long it had been there before I noticed. Sleep became a battle I often lost. I would wake to creaks and whispers I couldn't place, sometimes even convinced Milo was responding to things I couldn't see. On a Thursday night, around 1:30 a.m., I was writing when I heard it. Slow, deliberate creaks from the basement. Milo hissed and dashed under the bed. My hands shook as I grabbed the flashlight, every instinct screaming to run. The basement smelled of mildew and dust, but the beam of my flashlight fell on the rocking chair, moving back and forth by itself. I froze, mouth dry, heart thudding. And then I saw her. A figure emerging from the shadows, frail, old, eyes sharp, glinting as if she had been waiting for me to notice. I screamed, the sound bouncing off the bare walls, and ran upstairs, slamming the basement door. My pulse thundered in my ears. The police came quickly, but when they entered the basement, it was empty. No sign of forced entry. Nothing but the still, unassuming rocking chair. The officers exchanged glances, shrugging off my report as a misunderstanding or the stress of moving in. "Old houses do that sometimes," one said. But I knew it wasn't stress. It was something else entirely. Weeks passed. I avoided the basement, sleeping with Milo curled at my feet, double-locking doors, triple-checking windows. I learned about the previous owner, an elderly woman who had cared for a relative who disappeared mysteriously before selling the house. I began to suspect that the rocking chair, the basement, and the shadows were more than coincidence. They were memory made physical, a lingering presence unwilling to leave the house. I tried to write during the day, convincing myself I was sane, but nights became a trial of courage. The feeling of being watched never left, and Milo's fur would bristle even when the house seemed quiet. I realized that living alone, something I had longed for, came with responsibilities I hadn't anticipated, not just bills or chores, but confronting the unseen. One evening I sat on the couch with Milo in my lap, staring at the basement door. "You and I whispered, "we're going to survive this, okay?" He purred softly, as if in agreement, though I suspected he understood more than I did. By mid-August, I had established a cautious routine. Daytime was safe. Nights were not. I began experimenting with small rituals, leaving lights on, keeping doors locked, leaving a radio playing in the basement, anything to reassure myself that I was in control. And yet, control remained an illusion. It was a Friday night when I realized just how attached the presence in the house had become. I heard the creaks again, softer this time, as if testing my patience. I ignored them at first, telling myself it was the house settling. Milo hissed sharply, his hackles raised, and something in the pit of my stomach tightened. Summoning courage, I went to the basement again. The chair was still, but a faint outline of someone sitting seemed to hover near it. I couldn't see clearly, couldn't make sense of it, and yet I could feel her watching. I yelled, "I'm not afraid." The words sounded hollow even to my own ears. She didn't move, didn't respond, just watched. I left the basement shaking and locked the door behind me. That night, I barely slept. Every sound became amplified, the wind tapping the window, the groan of pipes, the soft shuffle of Milo's paws. During the day, I researched the history of the house, hoping for a rational explanation. The previous owner, Mr. Benson, had been quiet and private, often talking about the presence of family long gone. Locals whispered about his elderly relative disappearing mysteriously. There were no reports, no police calls, just stories that faded into memory. I realized that my fear wasn't just about a ghost, or an intruder, or even the house itself. It was about acknowledging that some things, memories, and attachments linger long after life moves on. I tried to rationalize everything. Perhaps it was exhaustion. Perhaps I was creating patterns where none existed. But rational thought collided with instinct. Milo refused to go near the basement door. I had to accept that something had imprinted itself on the house, and on me, and it wasn't going away. September brought a strange sense of routine. I avoided the basement completely, leaving it in the shadows as if that would satisfy whatever lingered there. I had begun to sleep more, though my dreams were filled with the rocking chair moving back and forth, and the glint of eyes in darkness. Milo had adapted, staying close to me, watching corners, ears twitching at sounds I couldn't hear. I invited a friend over once. Sophie, a fellow writer, stayed for coffee. She noticed the locks, the extra precautions, and raised an eyebrow. "Paranoid much?" she teased. I laughed, but my chest tightened. "You wouldn't understand," I said, though I wasn't sure I did either. That night I heard the creaks again. This time I whispered, "I see you." Nothing happened. Milo hissed and I felt strangely comforted. Acknowledgement seemed to matter. One evening, I decided to descend into the basement one last time, flashlight trembling in my grip. The chair sat still, dust motes dancing in the beam. I sat down in the wooden chair opposite it, breathing deeply. "I know you're here," I said softly. "I don't want to hurt you. I just want to live my life." The air felt colder. I didn't see her, but I felt her presence more strongly than ever. For the first time, I didn't feel fear, only a tense recognition. By the end of 2019, I had learned to live with the house and its memories. I never saw the old woman again, but I respected her space. I repaired the house, decorated with care, and kept Milo near. I realized that living alone didn't mean I could control everything. Some things weren't mine to command. They were echoes of the past, reminders that life and memory often linger where we least expect them. I often think about that summer, the fear, the sleepless nights, the creaking of the rocking chair. I understand now that living alone is not just about independence. It's about coexistence, accepting what we cannot see, acknowledging what we cannot control, and learning to respect the traces left behind by those who came before. Some houses remember their occupants long after they're gone. Some memories linger in corners, in furniture, in shadows. And sometimes, the most important lesson is learning to live alongside them without letting fear dominate your life. True courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to acknowledge it, coexist with it, and continue living fully despite it. I never thought inheriting a house would feel like stepping into someone else's memory, but that's exactly what it was. In late November of 2021, I moved into a small Victorian-style home in Asheville, North Carolina, left to me by a distant uncle I barely remembered. I was 29, recently single and desperate for solitude, hoping the quiet would help me reset after a rough breakup. My life as a photographer had always been solitary in some ways. Hours wandering abandoned buildings, framing empty streets, chasing shadows and light. But living completely alone brought a tension I hadn't anticipated. My only company was Rusty, a golden retriever who had been with me for 5 years, and whose instincts I trusted more than my own at times. The house had been empty for nearly 5 years, leaving dust and cobwebs clinging to the corners like stubborn memories. Sunlight barely penetrated the tall, narrow windows, making every space seem muted and slightly unreal. The first week was spent cleaning, sorting through my uncle's old belongings, and setting up my workspace in the attic. Among the oddities left behind, a tall, narrow wardrobe caught my attention. The wood was dark and intricately carved, charming in some ways but worn and faintly musty. The door was slightly warped, and when I touched it, the wood felt almost sticky in certain spots, as if it resisted my presence. I brushed it off as old age and placed it in my bedroom, telling myself I'd use it for storage. The first few nights were uneventful, though I began noticing small things. Rusty would growl at corners where no one was, or freeze, staring at walls or furniture as if tracking a movement I couldn't see. I laughed at myself sometimes, telling him, "Rusty, it's fine. There's nothing there." But my own unease was growing. I would wake in the middle of the night to the sound of something shifting, faint creaks almost like footsteps. The air would feel colder than the temperature, brushing my neck and making the hair on my arms stand on end. It all escalated on the third night. I was in bed, reviewing some shots I had taken that day when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic thumping from the wardrobe. At first I thought Rusty had knocked something over, but he was on the bed, growling and bristling. My heart hammered as I whispered, "Rusty, it's okay. It's just the wind." The sound didn't stop. I sat up, squinting into the dark corner of the room where the wardrobe stood. Nothing moved visibly, but the noise continued, steady and deliberate, like someone dragging their shoes across the floor inside it. I wanted to dismiss it, tell myself I was imagining things, but every instinct in my body screamed otherwise. I checked the locks and windows, reassuring myself the house was secure, but the unease didn't leave. That night, Rusty refused to sleep in his bed, curling instead between my feet and glancing repeatedly at the wardrobe. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, though the room was empty. Sleep came in fitful bursts, dreams thick with shadows that moved independently of me. I began to wonder if solitude was the wrong choice, if my desire for peace had somehow invited something else entirely into my life. A few nights later, the house made itself known in a more vivid way. I was editing photos in the living room when I glanced at a mirror and froze. Reflected behind me, was the image of an old man, tall and hunched, standing perfectly still. My pulse leapt and I spun around, only to find the room empty. Rusty barked furiously, darting from room to room, ears perked, hackles raised. I tried to rationalize it, exhaustion, isolation, the way light played tricks on the glass. But my instincts were screaming the same warning they always did. By the second week, I started keeping careful notes of everything. Time, sounds, temperatures, Rusty's reactions. Everything unusual followed a pattern, mostly nighttime, often in the bedroom, always near the wardrobe. I even set up a few small motion sensor cameras in discreet corners, hoping to capture an explanation. When you're alone in a house this old, paranoia is the only companion that feels like common sense. Then came the night that pushed me to the edge. It was raining hard, the kind of rain that thrums against the roof and windows, muffling every other sound. I woke to the low creaking coming from my bedroom. My heart raced. The wardrobe door was slightly ajar. Every fiber of my body told me to run, but I forced myself to grab a flashlight. Slowly, I edged toward it. The beam shook in my grip, falling across the warped carvings, highlighting dust motes dancing in the air. The door was empty. Or so I thought. A coat, old and moth-eaten, hung over the edge of the door. I hadn't placed it there. I didn't remember seeing it before. I froze, my mind cycling between logic and panic. Rusty growled low in his throat, his body tense. I spoke softly, more to myself than him. It's okay. It's okay. But my voice sounded hollow even to my ears. Sleep became impossible. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, every small shadow sent me into full alert. I realized I could no longer separate my imagination from reality. The house had its own rhythm now, and I was just an unwilling guest. I tried to regain some sense of control by setting up cameras throughout the house. I figured if there was someone breaking in, the footage would show it. If it was something else, maybe I could find proof, some tangible evidence to ground my sanity. A week later, I reviewed the footage. My stomach dropped. The wardrobe door opened and closed on its own, slowly, deliberately. One frame froze, a shadowy figure crouched inside, watching me. No footprints, no signs of entry, nothing to explain the presence. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours, unable to breathe. The neighbor, Mrs. Lang, an elderly woman who lived across the street, noticed my agitation. "You're not imagining things," she said when I confided a little. "That house, it's always held its memories. My brother knew your uncle. He was reclusive, kept to himself mostly, vanished without explanation in the 90s. They say the attic was his world. He didn't leave much behind." Her words sent a chill down my spine. The wardrobe wasn't just furniture. It was a relic, a vessel carrying the imprint of someone's life. Every night became a negotiation between fear and necessity. I avoided the wardrobe, slept with all doors locked, and kept Rusty close. He was my sentinel, growling at sounds I couldn't hear, watching corners I couldn't see. My photography, once a source of joy, now felt like a way to distract myself from the house, from the lingering presence that didn't want to be ignored. Days turned into weeks. I started experimenting with small rituals, leaving the wardrobe door slightly open, keeping a light on inside the bedroom, speaking aloud to the space. "I see you," I whispered one night. "I know you're here. I'm not trying to harm you." Rusty relaxed slightly, though he still watched the corners with wary eyes. That night, the usual creaks were softer, more hesitant, like a cautious acknowledgement. It was the first time I didn't feel pure fear. I began to understand that the house and its presence were intertwined. I wasn't just living in a house. I was sharing space with fragments of a life that had ended decades before, lingering in ways small and inexplicable. I could neither chase it away nor fully invite it. It was there, and I had to coexist. By the end of December, I had settled into a fragile routine. Rusty was calmer, and I had accepted the wardrobe as a silent companion. Photography became my refuge, a way to focus on creation instead of fear. I never saw the figure clearly again, but I felt its awareness in the quiet moments. The house had taught me something I didn't anticipate. Solitude isn't just about being alone. It's about living with yourself, with the past, and sometimes with presences that don't fully belong to this time. The wardrobe stood quietly, the carvings now familiar, the musty scent part of the rhythm of my life. I had learned to respect it, to acknowledge it without allowing it to dominate me. Living alone wasn't what I expected. It was more complicated, more layered, and sometimes more unsettling. Yet I survived, and with that survival came a deeper understanding of boundaries, respect, and coexistence. Some presences linger beyond life, but fear loses its power when we acknowledge the past, respect what we cannot control, and coexist with the unknown rather than fight it. I had always been drawn to historic homes. Their character, the way the wood smelled of decades, the subtle imperfections that told stories of lives long gone. So when I moved to Salem, Massachusetts, for a new software developer position in February 2020, the century-old townhouse I rented felt perfect. I was 26, fresh out of a long-term relationship, and ready for independence, though a small part of me worried about the isolation. The house was charming, but empty, creaking in ways that reminded me of the years it had witnessed. My nights were mostly spent alone, accompanied by the soft hum of my laptop as I worked late into the evenings. From the moment I stepped in, I noticed the attic hatch in the hallway ceiling. It had a single bare bulb wired years ago but long since disconnected. I had no intention of venturing up there immediately, but curiosity nagged at me. While unpacking, I discovered an old trunk covered in dust and cobwebs. It looked like something straight out of a history museum. I considered using it for books but decided to leave it closed while I settled in. The house was already full of creaks, shadows, and corners that seemed just a little too dark. I told myself it was just character, nothing more. The first week passed quietly, the only sounds being my typing, the hum of the heater, and the occasional creak of the floorboards. Then one evening around 11:30 p.m., I noticed a faint flicker of light coming from the attic crack. I froze. I lived alone. There were no bulbs turned on in the attic. I told myself it was the reflection from the street lamp outside, or maybe a trick of my tired eyes. But the flickering didn't stop. It was slow, deliberate, almost like someone was pacing back and forth. My stomach sank. I called my friend Marcus, trying to sound casual. "Hey, you won't believe this. I think my attic is haunted." Marcus laughed. "Much." "Maybe it's a ghost haunting your laptop, man. You've been working too," I didn't laugh. The light flickered again, teasing the shadows in the hallway. Rusty, my neighbor's golden retriever who occasionally stayed with me, growled sharply from the couch. His hackles were raised. I realized even the dog sensed something wrong. I shook off the chill and told myself I was imagining things. It had to be nothing. By the third night, the light had returned. It moved rhythmically, slow, almost deliberate, like it had a heartbeat. My curiosity overpowered my fear. I waited until it flickered again, then slowly approached the attic hatch. My hand shook as I reached for the ladder. The wood was cold, the rungs uneven under my weight. When I finally shone my flashlight into the attic, I froze. Crouched just inside the hatch was a figure, a man, thin and pale, eyes dark, staring directly at me. His grin didn't reach his eyes. I nearly dropped the flashlight. My throat constricted. I slammed the hatch shut and leaned against the wall, my heart hammering. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak, every settling noise made me jump. I realized my new home wasn't just old. It carried history, secrets, and perhaps even lingering presences that didn't intend to leave. The next morning I called the landlord, trying to remain calm. "The attic?" he said reluctantly. "Yeah, it's been sealed for years. Some break-ins a long time ago. Never caught the intruder." That explained the old trunk, the bare bulb and the aura of abandonment. The attic had been locked to keep trespassers out, but it didn't account for the sensation that I wasn't alone. I had always loved solitude, but now it came with an undercurrent of dread. Rusty began to growl whenever we passed the hallway. At first I thought it was random, but soon I noticed patterns. Lights flickering, floorboards creaking above, and the faint sound of footsteps when the house was completely empty. I installed cameras in the hallway and living room, hoping to find a rational explanation. One night, reviewing the footage, I saw the light flicker in the same rhythm as I had observed it. In one frame, I could make out a shadow, thin and hunched, crouched near the attic entrance. There were no footprints, no evidence of entry, nothing I could show the landlord. The figure wasn't trying to harm me, but its presence was deliberate. Watching, waiting. I tried rationalizing it: exhaustion, stress, shadows, reflections. But Rusty's fur bristling, the cold draft near the attic hatch, and that hollow feeling in my chest told me otherwise. I began sleeping with lights on, even leaving my laptop open in the living room as a sort of nightlight. The house felt alive, and I wasn't just a resident. I was part of its ongoing story. Weeks passed, and my life fell into a routine. Days at the office, evenings editing photos or writing code, nights punctuated by unease. Rusty would come to stay with me occasionally, his growls keeping me alert, reminding me that something in the house was watching. I avoided the attic, leaving it sealed, but the presence wasn't deterred. Every so often, I'd catch glimpses of flickering light, shadows moving unnaturally, or a sound that didn't belong. I began speaking aloud, half to myself, half to whatever lingered. "I see you," I whispered one evening. "I know you're here. I'm not here to hurt you." Rusty sat at my feet, ears raised, but for the first time he didn't growl. I realized that acknowledgement mattered more than fear. The house, the attic, the figure, it wanted recognition, not confrontation. I also researched the townhouse's history, reading old records and local papers, break-ins, reclusive tenants, minor accidents. The house had been standing for a century, and every occupant left a fragment behind. I had unknowingly stepped into a living history, and the figure in the attic was the most tangible part of that history. I decided to reclaim a sense of control. Motion sensor cameras, lights on timers, and keeping my workspace away from the hallway helped. I even brought small offerings of light into the attic, candles and a lantern I would leave near the hatch when I worked nearby, though never opening it. These rituals calmed me, though unease remained a constant companion. Rusty became my anchor. He would sleep at the base of the stairs, ears twitching at sounds I couldn't hear. The figure never approached aggressively, but the house had a rhythm I had to respect. I was no longer a visitor. I was a participant in its quiet, lingering memory. By late spring, I had adapted. The flickers continued sporadically, but I no longer froze in fear. I understood that the house was not hostile. It was alive with memory, echoes of the past that I could neither erase nor fully comprehend. I accepted that living alone in a historic home meant coexistence, not domination. I worked, photographed, and lived my life alongside the presence in the attic, acknowledging it without letting it control me. Every creak, flicker, and shadow became a reminder of history, of continuity, of the layers of life that remain after people leave. Solitude wasn't just being alone. It was understanding the lives that had existed before me and learning to live alongside them. True courage is learning to coexist with the unknown, respecting the past, and finding peace even when solitude brings lingering presences that cannot be controlled. I had always been the kind of person who craved peace but feared complete isolation. Growing up in a household with 3 siblings meant there was always noise, always someone needing something, and rarely a moment of true silence. By August of 2018, after a particularly painful breakup, I decided it was finally time to live alone. Portland, Oregon, had always appealed to me with its mix of greenery and urban charm, and when I found a small duplex tucked into a quiet street, I jumped at the chance. I was 34, a high school teacher by profession and more than ready for a sanctuary of my own. The duplex itself was charming, albeit a little dated. The floors creaked when I walked across them, the hallways were narrow, and the paint in the living room had faded into soft shades of beige over decades. My bedroom was spacious and had a large built-in closet with sliding wooden doors. For someone like me, a book collector, it was perfect. I had stacks of rare editions, first prints, and novels I'd collected over the years, all patiently waiting to be stored in that closet. The first week was a whirlwind of unpacking boxes, arranging books, and exploring the space. Whiskers, my sleek black cat, was as cautious as ever, darting under furniture and occasionally hissing at corners I knew were empty. At first I dismissed her behavior. Cats were quirky, especially in a new environment, but soon subtle things began to catch my attention. Clothes in the closet weren't exactly where I had left them, and Whiskers seemed particularly agitated whenever she was near the sliding doors. Then one night around 10:50 p.m. I was settling in with a book when I heard it, soft scraping noises coming from the closet. I paused, listening carefully. The house creaked, sure, but this felt different. It wasn't the typical settling of old wood, it was deliberate, almost like something or someone was moving inside. I shook my head and laughed nervously. "It's just Whiskers," I murmured. But Whiskers wasn't in the room at the time, and the hair on the back of my neck prickled. Over the next few nights, the noises persisted. At first, I tried keeping the closet doors open. I'd stand near the bed, half expecting to see something emerge, but nothing ever did. The sound of scraping continued, faint but deliberate. My mind began racing through worst-case scenarios: intruder, burglary, harassment. It was unsettling. The thought of someone watching me in what I had thought was a private space left me feeling exposed in a way I had never experienced before. Curiosity overcame fear, and I began examining the walls around the closet. I tapped, pressed my ear against the surface, and ran my fingers along the baseboards. That's when I found it, a small, barely noticeable hole in the shared wall with the neighboring unit. I froze. My pulse quickened. Someone could be watching me while I slept. The rational part of me screamed to leave it alone, but another part wanted answers. I didn't confront my neighbor immediately, fearing the confrontation might escalate into something dangerous. Instead, I covered the hole with tape and cardboard and began documenting every incident. Doors sliding on their own, items shifted inexplicably, and Whiskers remained hyper-alert, her green eyes fixed on that wall whenever she was in the bedroom. I even installed a small camera inside the closet, pointing toward the wall, hoping to capture whatever or whoever was responsible. I was nervous, but I needed evidence. I couldn't let myself slip into paranoia without proof. The first week with the camera was tense but uneventful. I watched the footage in real time, holding my breath every time the closet doors moved. Whiskers sat nearby, occasionally flicking her tail, as if she sensed the same tension I did. The next night, however, the camera caught something that made my stomach turn cold, a shadowy figure peering through the hole. It was brief, a flicker of dark clothing and an obscured face, but it was enough to confirm my worst fears. Someone had been observing me for weeks, quietly, without my knowledge. I felt a mix of panic and anger. How long had this been happening? Was my neighbor aware, or had the previous tenants been similarly watched? The thought of someone exploiting the duplex's shared walls for voyeurism made my skin crawl. I immediately called the landlord, explaining the situation. The man was quiet on the phone, hesitant to acknowledge the seriousness of what I was describing. "We've had complaints before," he admitted reluctantly. "Old duplexes. People forget how walls work sometimes, but we'll look into it." I also began sleeping with the closet doors locked, checking every corner before bed, and keeping a lamp on near the wall. Whiskers became my unofficial security, following me from room to room and hissing whenever I approached the closet. Each night felt longer than the last, filled with the subtle sounds of the duplex settling, my mind imagining footsteps behind walls, watching eyes, the faint rustle of clothing. Despite the fear, I continued documenting everything. The footage showed small movements, shadows stretching along the wall, the subtle shifting of items near the closet, and Whiskers reacting as if she could sense the presence I could only feel. The realization that I had been spied on was both frightening and humiliating. A sense of violation lingered, a constant weight that made me jump at every creak and whisper of wind through the hall. I finally made the decision to seal the hole permanently. I used wood filler and reinforced it with a thin piece of plywood, ensuring it could no longer be exploited. It wasn't easy. I worked late into the night, Whiskers pacing nervously nearby, but I wanted to regain control of my home. Once it was done, I informed the landlord again and filed a police report. The officer who came seemed skeptical at first, but seeing the camera footage changed that. They assured me someone would check the neighboring unit, though the intruder never returned openly. Even with the hole sealed, the experience left an impression. The duplex that had promised solitude now felt fragile. Every noise was scrutinized, every creak and shadow analyzed for hidden meaning. I tried to re-establish a sense of normalcy, bookshelves organized, Whiskers calm after long periods, but it was impossible to ignore the knowledge that walls could hide secrets. I began making small changes to reclaim the space. A small motion sensor in the bedroom, extra locks on the sliding closet doors, and new habits of checking corners before going to bed. These measures didn't eliminate the fear entirely, but they gave me a semblance of control. I would still sometimes hear minor creaks, but I no longer assumed the worst. I learned to live with the tension without letting it dominate my life. The neighborhood itself was quiet and friendly, a stark contrast to the violation I felt inside my own walls. My neighbor, an elderly man who rarely spoke beyond polite greetings, seemed unassuming, almost fragile. I never confronted him directly about what had happened, though part of me wanted answers. The law had addressed the immediate threat, but the psychological residue remained. At work, I threw myself into teaching, trying to occupy my mind during the day. At home, I tried to focus on my hobbies, reading, organizing my book collection, and spending time with Whiskers. Yet the duplex had changed me. I now appreciated the fragility of privacy, the way even familiar walls could conceal threats. I felt a heightened awareness of my surroundings, a constant, low-level vigilance that was exhausting but necessary. Weeks turned into months, and life gradually regained a rhythm. Whiskers adapted too, less jittery, but still occasionally hissing at corners. The locked closet doors became part of my nightly routine, a simple act that symbolized control and safety. I came to accept that while the intruder could no longer reach me, the memory of the breach would linger. It wasn't just the act itself. It was the realization that isolation could be exploited in ways I hadn't imagined. I found myself reflecting on personal boundaries and the importance of vigilance. Living alone had always been my dream, but the experience showed me that solitude also came with responsibilities. Securing my home, understanding potential risks, and accepting that not all dangers are visible. The duplex, with its narrow walls and creaky floors, had become a teacher of caution, reminding me that even comfort can harbor unseen threats. By the end of the year, I had fully settled into the duplex, though the lessons lingered. I checked the locks nightly, double-checked corners, and kept Whiskers close when moving around the house after dark. The sense of intrusion never completely disappeared, but it became a background hum rather than a dominating fear. I realized that living alone required more than independence. It required respect for boundaries, preparedness, and acceptance that some elements of life were beyond control. Though I never saw the intruder again, the experience permanently altered my perception of privacy. The duplex, once a sanctuary, now reminded me of vulnerability and vigilance. I still loved the house and my quiet evenings with Whiskers, but I no longer took solitude for granted. It was a privilege, fragile and precious, that required constant attention and care. Privacy is a fragile gift, and true independence comes not just from being alone, but from respecting boundaries, preparing for the unexpected, and acknowledging that even familiar spaces can conceal unseen dangers. I had always longed for a place to call my own, a space that felt like a sanctuary from the chaos of city life and the constant demands of work. In October 2020, at 31, I finally moved into a quiet cul-de-sac in Syracuse, New York. After years of cramped apartments and thin walls that allowed me to hear every argument, every late-night party, I was desperate for peace. The house I rented was modest but charming, a small front porch where I could sip coffee in the mornings, an attached garage, and a neatly fenced backyard where I could plant flowers and maybe even start a small vegetable patch. Tom, my husband, traveled frequently for work, so most nights, it was just me. And that was exactly how I liked it, or at least, that's what I told myself. The first week was an exhausting blur of unpacking boxes, hanging artwork, and arranging my few pieces of furniture in a way that felt just right. Milo, the Bennett's golden retriever who often wandered over from next door, seemed to approve of the porch, tail wagging as I settled into my new life. The Bennetts themselves were welcoming. Retired, cheerful, and genuinely kind, they brought over homemade cookies and gave me tips about the neighborhood. It felt like I was moving into a friendly little bubble, a pocket of calm in a city that often felt too loud. But their house went empty suddenly, for reasons I never quite understood. Within a month they had moved, leaving their home dark and quiet. Initially, it didn't bother me. I thought maybe they had gone to visit family, but that calm bubble started to fray the night I noticed someone moving into the empty house. He was a man in his 40s, tall and precise, with a quiet way of moving that set my nerves on edge. He dragged large boxes into his garage, all after dark, keeping his lights off during the day. Something about him didn't feel right, though I couldn't place exactly what. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing patterns. The man seemed to appear whenever I stepped outside, his head just barely visible above the garage wall or in the shadows behind a drawn curtain. I caught glimpses of strange, heavy shadows moving behind his garage windows. Once, while painting on the porch, I had the chilling sensation of eyes on me. I froze, brush in hand, and turned slowly. The space behind his closed garage door seemed empty, yet Milo barked insistently at nothing. My heart raced. I told myself I was imagining things, that my own anxiety was getting the best of me, but deep down I knew something was off. It started with little things, a faint scraping sound at night, the occasional flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. The first few nights I tried to convince myself it was just old house noises or shadows from streetlights bouncing through the trees. But there was an intensity to it, a deliberate quality that made me check locks obsessively and keep my blinds drawn at all hours. It wasn't just my imagination. Something or someone was observing, and the thought made the peaceful cul-de-sac feel suddenly vulnerable. By the end of the first month, I realized I couldn't ignore it anymore. I called my friend Jean, who lived 2 blocks away, to come over and sit with me one evening. I needed someone to confirm that I wasn't losing it, that the way the shadows moved and the noises occurred wasn't normal. When she arrived, we spent hours watching the yard, hoping to catch a glimpse of what or who was lurking. But the man never made a direct appearance. He was careful, deliberate, silent, and precise, and it was that calculated observation that made my skin crawl. A particularly rainy night brought everything to a head. Around 1:45 a.m., I was jolted awake by faint thuds from the garage next door. I pressed my ear to the window, heart hammering in my chest. The door rattled as though someone was inside, moving heavy objects, but no lights were on. The rain made it impossible to see clearly, shadows flickering across the yard, like ghostly shapes. I debated calling the police immediately, but hesitated. What could I tell them? That I thought my new neighbor was spying on me? I wasn't sure if it was paranoia or reality. I picked up the phone and called Jean. I think something's happening next door. Can you come over? I whispered, barely moving my lips. She arrived within 10 minutes, flashlight in hand, her presence steadying me. Together we approached the garage cautiously. Every step felt amplified, the wet pavement slippery beneath our feet. We knocked on the door. No answer. The door was slightly ajar, moving gently with the wind, but that didn't explain the thuds we had heard. We stepped inside. Darkness enveloped us. The smell of damp cardboard and old wood filled the air. As our eyes adjusted, we saw stacks of boxes neatly arranged. At first glance it seemed ordinary, but then we noticed the markings, strange numbers and symbols scrawled across the boxes. Some items inside were unfamiliar, small trinkets and objects that didn't make sense. Milo barked at the edges of the room, fur bristling. "This isn't normal," Jean muttered, her voice tense. We stayed inside for a few minutes, listening to faint scraping sounds that seemed to come from deeper within the garage. But there was no one there. By morning, the van parked outside had vanished, and the man had disappeared as quietly as he had arrived. He never introduced himself, never explained, never acknowledged our presence. I felt a mix of fear, confusion, and helplessness. How long had he been watching? What was he doing with those objects? The questions circled endlessly in my mind. I called the neighborhood watch and filed a report, though I doubted it would lead anywhere. The authorities listened politely but warned me that without concrete evidence, the situation might remain unresolved. That night I triple-checked all locks, installed cameras near the garage, and kept every door in the house secured. Even small tasks, watering plants, walking to the mailbox, felt heavy with anxiety. Every shadow seemed amplified, every creak of the porch under my feet a potential warning. The incident changed the rhythm of my life. Painting on the porch, once a source of comfort, became a tense exercise in vigilance. Even the neighbor's dog Milo sensed something invisible in the yard, barking at spaces that appeared empty. I began to wonder if solitude was truly safe, or if living alone was a vulnerability I had underestimated. My haven had become a space layered with observation, manipulation, and uncertainty. Days turned into weeks, and I learned to adapt, though unease remained constant. The cameras I installed captured only fleeting shadows, glimpses of movement that vanished before I could understand them. The markings on the boxes remained a puzzle, and I began noticing small inconsistencies in my yard. Displaced stones, bent branches, footprints that didn't match any dog or human. The cul-de-sac, once a sanctuary, now felt like a stage set, and I was an unwilling participant in a story I didn't understand. I spoke to Jean often, sharing observations and fears. "You're not imagining it," she said one evening after reviewing camera footage with me. "There's something off. Someone's been here, moving things, watching. I've seen enough true crime to know the patterns." Her reassurance helped, though it did nothing to eliminate the lingering dread. I began keeping a journal, cataloging every anomaly, every sound, every glimpse of movement. It became a record, a way to reclaim some sense of control over a situation that felt entirely uncontrollable. Sleep became fractured. I would wake at odd hours, convinced I heard the faint thud of boxes or the creak of a door I had triple-locked. At first, I tried rationalizing: wind, animals, plumbing. But rationalizations fell flat when Milo's fur would bristle and his low growl would echo in the quiet. I realized that the presence wasn't necessarily physical, or at least not always, but psychological. The man, whoever he was, had inserted himself into my awareness, into my daily life, without ever stepping into it fully. I started taking precautions I hadn't thought necessary before: additional locks, sensor lights, and even a small motion alarm on the porch. Each measure provided a sense of control, but control only masked the underlying truth. Someone had breached my space and left a permanent mark on my sense of security. The cul-de-sac wasn't simply a neighborhood. It was a space where unknown forces could act invisibly, shaping my days and nights without accountability. By midwinter I had adapted, though cautiously. I could water my garden, retrieve the mail, and walk to the corner store without panic. But vigilance had become second nature. Every interaction with the surrounding houses carried a shadow of suspicion. The new neighbor never appeared, yet his impact lingered in every creak, every movement, every wind-blown shadow. I accepted that I might never understand his intentions or his methods. Jean and I continued our nightly reviews of camera footage, though we rarely saw anything concrete. Occasionally, a shadow or flicker would appear, fleeting and incomprehensible. I learned to observe without reaction, to maintain routines that asserted my presence and control. The act of vigilance became a quiet rebellion, a way to declare, even silently, that my space remained mine. I also began focusing more on the positive: painting, reading, gardening. The rituals of home ownership became grounding, anchoring me in reality even as the unseen presence reminded me of fragility. Milo remained a constant companion, a reminder that even in the face of uncertainty, there was a reliable thread of companionship and security. By spring, I had found equilibrium. The cul-de-sac, though shadowed by uncertainty, became a home in its own right. I never saw the man again, nor did I uncover the meaning behind his nocturnal activities. But the experience had changed me profoundly. I had learned that solitude, while desirable, carried vulnerabilities that required vigilance. I had learned to document, to secure, and to respect the fragility of personal space. Even months later, I sometimes caught myself pausing at the garage, feeling a subtle tension in my chest. I still triple-checked locks, monitored camera feeds, and kept an attentive eye on the yard. But I also appreciated the sanctuary I had created, fragile, imperfect, yet mine. The experience had not stripped me of my peace entirely. It had taught me how to protect it. True security is a combination of vigilance, awareness, and respect for personal boundaries. Solitude can be a gift, but it is fragile, and safeguarding it requires proactive care and mindfulness of the unseen risks around us. Moving to Maple Street should have felt exciting, like starting a new chapter in my life, but it didn't feel that way at first. I'm Julian Hayes, 13, and I'd spent most of my life moving from apartment to apartment with Mom, Marissa, and my little sister Clara. We'd never had a proper house until now, modest, 2 stories, a small backyard, and neighbors who seemed just close enough to wave, but far enough to mind their own business. I was happy about my room. Shelves lined with miniature model airplanes, a workbench covered in paints, glue, and tiny screws. This was my zone. For the first time, I felt like I had control over a space that was completely mine. Mom was thrilled, of course, but she had a night shift schedule that often left me and Clara on our own in the evenings. She tried to make everything feel normal, cooking dinner before heading to the hospital and reminding us to lock doors, feed Scout, and finish homework. Clara, at 8, was mostly happy to explore the backyard or watch cartoons. I, on the other hand, noticed the details: the slight tilt of the neighbor's blinds, the occasional shadow moving across the windows, and the silence that seemed too heavy on one side of the street. They never waved, they never spoke. It was unnerving. A few weeks into living there, Mom had a 12-hour shift, and it was my first real night alone. I set up my paint tray and model plane on the workbench, trying to immerse myself in the delicate brush strokes and glue applications. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping, tap, 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 coming from the back window. My heart skipped. At first, I convinced myself it was rain, a branch, anything ordinary. But the tapping continued, slow, deliberate. I froze. I edged closer to the blinds, trying to peek without being noticed. That's when I saw it, a dark figure standing motionless near the neighbor's driveway. I couldn't make out features, just a silhouette, and it was staring in our direction. My pulse spiked. Scout growled low in his throat, ears pinned back, hackles raised. The sound made my stomach tighten. I whispered, "It's okay, Scout, stay calm," though my voice trembled. The tapping stopped, but a faint smoke scent drifted in from the side yard. Instinct screamed at me that something was wrong. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but the line was dead. Panic took over. Scout barked sharply, and I grabbed his leash, running to the backyard, trying to locate the source of the smoke. Flames licked the corner of the neighbor's garage. My stomach dropped, adrenaline surging. I yelled for Clara, who was in her room watching TV, to come outside. She scrambled out, eyes wide with fear. Firefighters arrived in minutes, but to me, it felt like hours. They sprayed water, smoke curling upward into the dark night. The garage was badly damaged, and I learned later that it was no accident. The police explained it was a targeted arson attack, related to a long-standing dispute over property ownership in the neighborhood, something I had overheard adults whispering about but never understood completely. Mom returned home later, exhaustion and shock etched across her face. She hugged Clara first, then me, holding us close as if she could absorb all the tension and fear herself. I wanted to cry but didn't. I just clung to Scout, feeling the warmth of the hose-soaked yard and the faint smell of burnt wood. Maple Street looked calm again, quiet as if nothing had happened, but I knew better. That night I realized how quickly ordinary life could flip, how thin the line between safety and danger really was. After that night, nothing felt normal. I found myself double-checking locks, peering through blinds at every rustle of shadow, listening for the faintest hint of footsteps outside. Mom tried to reassure me, but I could see the tension on her face. She told me to focus on my models, to let the stress roll off me, but my hands shook every time I heard the wind brush the trees or the faint creak of the garage door next door. Scout refused to go near the fence without me, growling whenever he caught a movement. I started keeping a journal, logging everything unusual I noticed. The time the tapping started, smoke smell in the yard, glimpses of silhouettes. Writing it down made me feel like I had some control, like I wasn't just a bystander in a story I didn't want to be part of. Clara didn't understand. She wanted to play or watch TV, laughing as if nothing mattered, but I couldn't. Something about being 13 and responsible for the safety of your family made every creak, every shadow, feel amplified. I tried to distract myself with model airplanes, painting wings, attaching tiny propellers, gluing pieces together with careful precision. It helped sometimes. I'd sit for hours, focusing on details, letting my brain lock onto something I could manipulate. But even then I would catch myself glancing at the window, thinking I saw the neighbor's darkened garage or a shadow that wasn't there. One evening, while finishing a model, I heard a scrape along the driveway. Not like last time, but something softer, almost deliberate. Scout barked and darted to the door. I tiptoed to the window, holding my breath. A pair of legs were visible, dark jeans and shoes, but no one else. I blinked and they were gone, leaving only the faint smell of smoke. My stomach knotted. Maple Street might look calm, but it wasn't safe. The lesson I had learned that night was still fresh, raw. Danger could be silent, invisible, yet right next door. Over the next month, the fire left more than just charred wood behind. The memory lingered, creating tension in our home. Mom adjusted her night shifts where she could, but it wasn't enough. Clara kept asking questions, curious about what had happened, but I realized early on that adults often lie to shield children from the full truth. I told her it was an accident, that the firefighters handled it. It was partially true, but I kept the fear to myself, locking it away as I focused on controlling what I could. My models, the locks, Scout. I noticed more subtle changes in the neighborhood. Mailboxes tilted oddly, fences looked weathered, doors that should have been closed seemed ajar for no reason. Shadows moved in places they shouldn't. I began taking nightly walks with Scout, trying to keep an eye on things. Sometimes I saw movement in the neighbor's yard, shapes shifting silently, and I would freeze, heart pounding. I never approached. I had learned the lesson that curiosity sometimes brings more danger than knowledge. One night, around midnight, I woke to a smell of smoke again. My heart raced as Scout barked and growled at the window. I grabbed a flashlight and my phone, though the lines often went dead, and peeked outside. Nothing was burning this time, but a faint outline of someone crouched by the garage caught my eye. I froze. The figure vanished when I blinked. I didn't call for help immediately. I simply stayed put, watching, waiting, Heart-hammering. That night, sleep didn't come until hours later. Months passed. The fire had been contained, the neighbor investigated, but Maple Street had changed in my mind. I still painted models, glued wings together, and crafted planes, but every movement outside reminded me to be vigilant. Life continued. Mom returned to her shifts. Clara grew oblivious to my anxieties, and Scout remained my protector. I understood that fear could be managed, channeled into focus, and that control over small things, like miniature planes, could give you power in a world that sometimes feels unpredictable. Maple Street appeared calm, friendly even, but I knew now that danger could lurk behind silent windows and drawn curtains, waiting for a moment when no one expected it. Even in familiar, peaceful places, unseen dangers exist. Awareness, preparedness, and the ability to focus on what you can control are vital. Fear is natural, but it can be transformed into vigilance and resilience, turning uncertainty into strength. I've always been the type of person who likes control. 16 years on this planet, and I thought I had a pretty good handle on things. Schoolwork, guitar practice, and even keeping my little brother Eli in line whenever Mom and Dad went out. But control is an illusion. At least that's what I realized the night everything changed. It was a chilly November evening in 2025. My parents had flown to Seattle for a last-minute business trip, leaving me home alone at 408 Elmwood Drive. Eli was at our aunt's for the night, which should have made things easy. Peace and quiet. Normally, I'd take the opportunity to sit in my room, posters plastered across the walls, guitar in hand, and practice until my fingers hurt. Tonight, though, something felt off. Maybe it was the wind rattling the window panes, the way the radiator groaned, or just that uneasy feeling I sometimes get when no one else is around. I was tuning my guitar when the landline rang. The number was unfamiliar, and I figured it was a wrong call. I picked it up casually. "Hello?" My voice echoed strangely in the empty apartment. Heavy breathing answered me. That was it. No words, just slow, labored breathing that seemed almost deliberate. I froze. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice shakier than I wanted. Silence. I hung up, telling myself it was some prank, maybe a telemarketer with a malfunctioning mic. Minutes later, the phone rang again. Hesitant, I answered, pressing the receiver to my ear like it might bite me. A voice barely above a whisper hissed, "I see you. I'm in the kitchen." My stomach turned. "This isn't funny," I said, heart hammering. I jumped up and checked the kitchen. Nothing, not a sound. The knives gleamed harmlessly in their block, and the refrigerator hummed. Then it happened again. The voice detailed my movements. Now on the couch, by the guitar, behind the curtains. Each description hit like a punch to the chest. I gripped my baseball bat, the one Dad insisted I keep for emergencies. I crept slowly through the apartment, checking every shadow, every corner. My own pulse felt deafening in the silence. When I reached the living room, I froze. My reflection stared back at me from the TV screen, but behind it, in the darkened corner, a crouched figure barely moved, eyes seemingly locked on mine. For a moment, time stopped. My brain screamed, "Run!" But my feet felt rooted to the floor. Instinct finally kicked in. I bolted, slamming the door behind me, fumbling with the lock. Scouted down the hallway, stairwell, and finally burst into the lobby. The night shift security guard looked up, startled. "Nathan, what's wrong?" I gasped out my story, unable to stop trembling. He radioed the police immediately. By the time the officers arrived, the apartment was empty. No sign of forced entry. Nothing. But forensic evidence later revealed tiny, muddy footprints near the back entrance. Someone had been inside, moving silently, just beyond my perception. My sense of control shattered. The days after that night were a haze. Sleep became a stranger, and the apartment, once my sanctuary, felt claustrophobic, like walls could close in at any moment. I left lights on everywhere, double-checked locks multiple times before bed, and kept the baseball bat by my side. Even my guitar lost its charm. The familiar strumming felt hollow when I imagined someone silently watching from the shadows. I talked to Mom on the phone constantly. "Nathan, you're overthinking," she said at first. But when I recounted the footprints and the whispered messages, her tone shifted. "We'll install cameras," she promised. And we did. Motion sensor cameras went up in the living room, hallway, and kitchen. The footage was unsettling. Nothing unusual at first, but every few hours, the cameras picked up faint, almost imperceptible movements, like shadows shifting without reason. The paranoia bled into school life. I'd jump at the slightest noise in the hallway, imagine classmates sneaking into my backpack, or visualize strangers hiding just out of sight. Friends noticed. "Dude, calm down," my best friend Alex said one afternoon. "It's an apartment. You're safe." But he didn't understand. Safety is relative, I learned. Absolute safety doesn't exist when someone can invade your space without warning, without leaving obvious traces. Scout, our golden retriever, became my anchor. His growls, low and warning, guided me. He seemed to sense when someone or something wasn't right. Some nights I'd follow him around the apartment, flashlight in hand, checking windows and doors, waiting for movement that never came. One evening, around 2 a.m., the phone rang again. I jumped so hard I nearly dropped it. "I know you're awake," the whisper hissed. "I see you." The sound made my blood run cold. I left it off the hook and never picked it up again. From that moment, my only communication was with the cameras and Scout. Weeks passed, and I tried to reclaim some normalcy. School, homework, and music offered brief relief, but the apartment always reminded me of that night. I avoided the back door entirely, refusing to open it even for fresh air. I even rearranged furniture to block sightlines into the living room. Every noise became a threat, every shadow a potential intruder. I realized my fear wasn't irrational, it was survival. Someone had been there, creeping silently, watching, tracking my every movement. I learned to trust instincts over logic, to respond to gut feelings even when they seemed paranoid to others. One night, I stayed up recording the apartment with every camera, determined to catch anything unusual. Hours passed, and I almost dozed off when a frame froze my heart. A shadow moved in the hallway, fleeting but distinct. Nothing else appeared in the footage. No face, no body, just a shifting darkness. My stomach twisted. Someone had been inside without my knowledge. I called the police again, but the evidence was slim. The footprint analysis had been inconclusive. Still, I knew the truth. My home, my safe place, had been invaded. I could never unsee it, never feel entirely secure again. Months later, I adjusted. Lights stayed on, locks were checked religiously, and Scout became both protector and companion. I returned to my guitar, strumming more carefully, almost ritualistically. The apartment remained my space, but a lesson lingered. Solitude can be deceptive. You can be alone yet observed, confident yet vulnerable. Awareness, preparation, and respect for your environment became part of daily life. I still flinch at phone calls from unknown numbers. I check shadows twice, listen for the softest sounds. But I also learned resilience, the ability to act under fear, to reclaim control in moments where it feels like none exists. The apartment no longer terrifies me the way it did, but I'll never forget how quickly ordinary life can become extraordinary danger when someone else's presence goes unseen. True safety isn't guaranteed by walls or locks. It comes from vigilance, preparedness, and trusting your instincts. Fear can be overwhelming, but when channeled wisely, it strengthens awareness and resilience, turning vulnerability into actionable caution. I had always dreamed of having a place to call my own. When I first walked into the house at 57 Cedar Lane, Eugene, Oregon, in April 2023, it felt like stepping into a dream I had been saving for years. At 25, I'd spent most of my life either living with my parents or bouncing between roommates, never truly alone. This was mine, my walls, my floorboards, my windows. The first night, I stayed up arranging my sketches along the walls, placing my thrifted furniture exactly where I wanted it. The room smelled faintly of cedar and fresh paint. I could imagine myself here, painting late into the night with only my favorite music for company. The first couple of nights were quiet, too quiet, and I reveled in it. But by the third night, unease began to creep in. I was unpacking boxes in the bedroom, humming along to a soft tune on my speakers, when I heard it, a creaking above me. At first I paused and shook my head. Houses settle, I told myself. Old houses like mine make sounds. But then it came again, a low thump followed by a scuffle. I froze, letting my ears adjust to the silence that followed. I called my parents, trying to make it sound casual. "It's probably just the attic." I laughed, but my voice wavered. They reassured me, but I could hear the concern beneath their words. I called a pest control company the next day. Their technician poked around in the attic, checked the insulation, and assured me there were no rats, no raccoons, nothing that could explain the noises. That's when I realized I wasn't imagining it. Someone, or something, was in the attic. Curiosity overpowered my fear. I got a flashlight and my old baseball bat from high school, the one I kept for emergencies. My hands shook as I climbed the ladder, each step creaking under my weight. The attic smelled of dust and old wood. I pressed the flashlight against the far corner, heart hammering, and that's when I noticed the wall panel, slightly warped, as if it had been moved recently. I took a deep breath and pushed it aside. Behind it was a small space, just large enough to crouch in. Blankets were piled in one corner, food wrappers scattered across the floor, and a few personal belongings, like an old backpack and a tattered journal. My stomach turned. I wasn't alone. A low, raspy voice came from the shadows. "Who are you?" My heart skipped a beat. Out of the darkness, a disheveled woman emerged. Her eyes were wide, fearful, and wild. I live here," she whispered, almost apologetically. Panic surged through me. I froze, gripping the bat tighter. "You can't live here. What are you doing?" I demanded, though my voice shook. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slumped against the wall, mumbling incoherently. I backed down the ladder, locked myself in my bedroom, and called 911. The police arrived within minutes. Marina, as she was later identified, was taken into custody. The officers explained that she had a history of trauma and homelessness, which had led her to hide in my attic. Even after she was gone, the house felt different. I installed new locks, reinforced the attic panel, and triple-checked every door and window. I began writing in a journal every night, trying to process the fear that lingered. The experience had shattered my sense of complete safety, and I knew I'd never take solitude for granted again. Days passed, and I tried to reclaim the excitement I had felt when moving in. I painted the walls, arranged my furniture, and set up my workspace by the window, hoping the sunlight would chase away the lingering fear. But at night, every creak and shift in the floorboards made me tense. Scout, the neighbor's dog that wandered occasionally, would growl outside my window, and I would find myself checking the locks for the third, fourth, even fifth time. I talked to the police detective who had handled Marina's case. "It's unlikely she'll come back," he said. "She's been placed in temporary housing and offered counseling. You're safe now." I wanted to believe him, but every time I climbed the attic ladder to retrieve something, my hands trembled, my imagination conjuring shadows moving behind the walls. One night I decided to confront my fear directly. I brought a flashlight, my bat, and my cat Milo, who usually stayed away from the attic. Milo perched on my shoulder as I slowly pushed open the reinforced panel. Everything was empty, blankets gone, nothing but dust and old spiderwebs. My heartbeat slowed and I laughed nervously. "It's just you and me now," I whispered to Milo. Yet even as I said it, the silence felt heavy, almost watchful. I realized that living alone wasn't just about solitude, it was about vigilance. I couldn't just relax completely, not yet. The house had a history now, and I was aware that someone could occupy spaces I thought were mine, in ways I couldn't foresee. Weeks went by, and I tried to build routines that reminded me of control. I painted every evening, sometimes until 2 a.m., with soft jazz playing, lights all around the room. I kept a log of noises, small movements, and strange occurrences, documenting every anomaly. Milo became my constant companion, circling the rooms, sensing what I could not. It wasn't just the attic anymore. Sometimes I'd hear faint scuffling in the basement or a whisper-like sound from the kitchen. I reminded myself logically that it could be the house settling, plumbing, or rodents. But after what happened with Marina, I couldn't dismiss instinct entirely. I invested in cameras, motion sensors, and even a small security system, creating a sense of order and reassurance. One rainy evening, while I was painting by the window, I noticed a shadow flicker across the backyard. My stomach twisted. I grabbed the bat and crept toward the sliding glass door. Nothing. The rain had created strange shapes with the porch light. Still, the experience reminded me that even my well-secured home could be infiltrated if I wasn't careful. I spent the next few days reinforcing doors, locking windows, and checking the attic panel 3 times a day. My independence, which had once felt exhilarating, now came with responsibility and constant awareness. I had learned the weight of living alone, how every sound could be meaningful, and how quickly security could be compromised. Months later, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. I painted, sketched, and decorated, finding comfort in routines and small victories. I could sleep without panic, though I kept the attic panel locked. Milo would settle beside me as I worked, a reassuring presence. Occasionally, I still heard a creak, a faint thud, or a scratching noise, but I had tools, locks, and systems to handle them. Living alone taught me more than independence. It taught me vigilance, resilience, and respect for personal space. Safety isn't absolute. It's a combination of preparation, awareness, and instinct. My first months alone had been frightening, but they also shaped me into someone more mindful, cautious, and aware of the fragile line between security and intrusion. Independence carries responsibility. True safety comes not from walls alone, but from vigilance, awareness, and the courage to confront fear. Being alone requires both freedom and preparation, reminding us that personal security is a fragile balance and resilience is key to maintaining it. I had babysat plenty of times before, but that rainy October evening of 2024 at 132 Willow Creek Drive in Richmond, Virginia, felt different from the moment I stepped inside. I was 19, a college student majoring in literature, and I had a reputation among parents for being cautious and responsible. Babysitting courses and years of practice had made me confident in most situations, but something about that house on the quiet cul-de-sac unsettled me the instant I saw it. The house was large and elegant, with pale yellow siding slick with rain and a neat porch lined with planters. The twins, Liam and Sophie, were cheerful as they ran ahead, jumping over puddles with their tiny rain boots. Their parents explained the schedule: bedtime by 8:30, lights out by 9, and no wandering in the kitchen while they were gone. I assured them I understood and would take good care of the kids. Once the parents left, I felt the first wave of isolation hit me. The quiet was heavier than expected, the constant patter of rain on the roof the only sound. I guided Liam and Sophie through their bedtime routine, tucking them in with bedtime stories and soft songs. Once they were asleep, I poured myself a cup of tea and settled on the living room couch with my notebook. I wanted to read, maybe jot down a few ideas for my creative writing class. That's when I noticed it. A flicker in the reflection of the glass by the porch. At first I thought it was a trick of the shadows, but then I saw him. A man, standing perfectly still in the yard, staring at the house. His dark clothes were plastered to him from the rain, and his face was impossible to make out. My heart slammed against my ribs and I swallowed hard. I grabbed my phone and called the parents, explaining what I saw. "Oh, Hannah, it's probably just a neighbor walking by," Mr. Pierce said dismissively. "Don't worry so much." I tried to laugh it off, but the unease didn't leave. I couldn't focus on my notebook, couldn't enjoy my tea. Every shadow in the living room felt alive. I double-checked the locks on the front and back doors, sliding locks, windows, every one of them. The man didn't move, didn't react to the porch lights, didn't blink. I felt like a rabbit in a cage, aware that someone could try to enter at any moment. Hours passed and the rain didn't let up. I kept glancing at the window, trying to convince myself it was all imagination. But I couldn't shake the feeling that his eyes were fixed on us, following my every movement. My hand rested on the edge of the couch, brushing Liam's soft blanket, as though holding on to something tangible might keep me sane. By the time the clock edged past midnight, I felt exhausted, my nerves stretched thin. I stayed awake until I heard the car pull into the driveway. Relief flooded through me, but when I opened the front door to let the parents inside, I froze. Muddy footprints led up the steps and stopped just outside the twins' bedroom door. No one was there now, but the evidence made my stomach drop. The peers were horrified, and I felt a chill that wouldn't leave my bones. I realized how vulnerable the kids, and I, had been. The quiet cul-de-sac, the friendly-seeming neighborhood, even my own alertness, had not guaranteed safety. That night marked the first time I understood the weight of responsibility, when someone else's life depended entirely on me. The next morning, sunlight streaming through the wet windows didn't bring the comfort I expected. Every shadow in the house reminded me of the dark figure I had seen. I kept replaying that moment when I spotted him on the porch, still as a statue, and the footprints outside the twins' bedroom. How had no one heard him? How had he gotten so close without making a sound? I called my best friend Carla on the phone. She tried to calm me, suggesting I was imagining things, but I knew better. Babysitting had always felt like a game, a responsibility I could handle, but that night reminded me that vigilance could never be optional. Later that week, I signed up for a self-defense class. I practiced basic moves, held my pepper spray, and imagined scenarios over and over. I wanted to be ready, not just for myself, but for anyone who trusted me to protect them. The peers also decided to install additional security measures. I helped by checking locks, making a list of the windows and doors that could be reinforced. They purchased alarms that sounded immediately in the event of entry and motion sensors for the yard. I felt slightly safer, but I noticed that every sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the squeak of the floorboards, made me jump. I couldn't stop scanning the house, imagining he could return at any moment. Even when I babysat other families, my eyes lingered on dark corners. I learned to trust my instincts, to act on that tiny internal voice that whispers, "Something isn't right." It was exhausting but empowering. I realized that vigilance wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. Weeks later, I returned to the Willow Creek house for a second babysitting job. The parents had installed cameras in the yard and hallways. At first I felt absurd, constantly checking the monitors, but then I remembered the man in the rain, the footprints, the invisible proximity that had terrified me. The twins were themselves again, full of laughter and energy, but I couldn't let my guard down. Every time a shadow passed the window, I instinctively reached for the monitor, making sure it was just a branch or a stray animal. I realized that my fear had evolved into caution, and I welcomed it. I would never let complacency replace responsibility. At night, while reading by the living room lamp, I kept one eye on the cameras. Hours passed uneventfully, but my mind still imagined him, standing silently, waiting. I would never forget that sensation, the weight of being watched and powerless. Months later, I started sharing my experience with other young babysitters. I warned them about trusting instincts, about checking exits and locks, about taking precautions even in the safest-looking neighborhoods. Their wide eyes mirrored the same dawning understanding I had felt that night. I also started practicing mental exercises to manage anxiety. I learned that vigilance was different from fear. It was preparation. I carried a small flashlight and a whistle on every babysitting job, double-checked doors, and made notes of emergency exits. My fear had transformed into a skill I could teach others. Even now, long after that night, whenever I walk past a window or see a shadow in the yard, I feel a twinge of unease. I know that danger can be silent, slow, and patient. That one night at 132 Willow Creek Drive changed me profoundly. It taught me to trust my instincts, to respect caution, and to recognize that vigilance is not overreaction. It's responsibility. I continued babysitting, confident yet alert. I reinforced my boundaries, protected those who depended on me, and stayed aware of the world outside the walls I controlled. The memory of that still man in the rain never fully left me, but it became a reminder that preparation, attention, and courage are the truest forms of protection. Safety requires awareness, preparation, and trust in your instincts. Even the quietest neighborhoods can conceal unseen threats, and responsibility means acting before danger arrives, not after it has already struck. Vigilance and courage are essential tools for protecting yourself and those who depend on you. The first time I saw her lips move, I felt something shift in the air, a vibration just beneath my skin, as if the room itself had inhaled and forgotten to let go. I was 28 then, working at a modest tech firm in Portland, Haven Systems, a place I'd come to think of as less a career and more a plateau. The sort of job you don't brag about but also don't run from. My days were predictable, sometimes suffocatingly so. Cloud security, compliance, integration testing, Jira tickets. The rhythm of my life was more mechanical than human. I told myself I liked the stability, but in truth it dulled me, ground me down into someone I barely recognized. It wasn't until Elena arrived that things began to loosen, or maybe unravel. She came into the office quietly, without fanfare. HR new hire. Dark hair, pale skin, bun so tight it looked painful. At first, she blended in with the blur of half-strangers I passed in hallways or saw microwaving their lunches. But in time, she began to take up a disproportionate amount of space in my mind. It wasn't her looks. She was pretty, yes, but not in the way that keeps you awake at night. It was something harder to name, something that moved in the gaps in the moments when nobody else was looking. The first real moment happened in the break room. I'd gone in for coffee, my third that morning. The lights in there always seemed a little too bright, buzzing overhead like angry insects. That day the air smelled faintly metallic, like the fridge had been left open too long. She was standing by the far wall, her head bent, lips moving quickly, soundlessly. Her hands hung slack at her sides. Empty. For a second I thought maybe she was on Bluetooth. But no, nothing in her ears, nothing in her pockets. Just her and the wall. Hey, I said, trying for casual. Her head jerked, eyes locking onto mine with a sharpness that made my stomach dip. Then just like that, she softened, smiled faintly. Hi. That was it. I nodded, poured my coffee, left. But the image clung. The wall, the whispering, the way she startled like an animal pulled from a dream. I told myself it was nothing. People talk to themselves, right? Stress, rehearsal, nerves. Except I started noticing her more after that. Or maybe she was just making herself noticeable. Over the next couple weeks, the pattern repeated. Always in the break room, always to the wall. Sometimes her hair was loose, hanging like a veil across her cheeks, her mouth working fast, too fast for me to catch words. And then, one day I did. I slowed as I entered, trying not to make noise. She didn't notice. Her whisper was ragged, hurried. They don't. Not yet. Not yet, Daniel. My own name. I froze, breath catching in my throat. I nearly dropped the water bottle I'd come for. She didn't turn. Didn't stop. Just kept whispering into the blank white wall. I left without a word. That night I told myself I'd misheard. I had to have misheard. But then came the forms. A week later, during some HR compliance thing, she came by my desk with a stack of papers. Her voice was quiet but clear as she said, "Here you go, Daniel. Just my name. Normal enough." Except she lingered. For a heartbeat too long. Her gaze locked on me, eyes too sharp, too aware. "Thanks," I muttered, forcing a smile. She didn't move. Not right away. I felt heat rise in my neck under her stare. Then she turned, walked off, leaving me with the peculiar weight of her attention pressing against my chest. That night I mentioned it to Kara, my girlfriend of 3 years. We'd been drifting, though I didn't say that out loud. She probably just has a crush, Kara said, scrolling her phone. You're reading too much into it. Maybe, but my gut disagreed. The first real warning came from Mark. We were in the cafeteria, both of us hunched over mediocre sandwiches. I decided to test the waters, keep it light, so, is it just me or is Elena a little different? Mark's reaction was too quick. He set down his sandwich, leaned closer, his voice dropping. Difference, one way to put it. Just keep your distance, okay? She's intense. What do you mean? He shook his head. I've said too much already. Just don't get too involved. The words hung in my ears long after lunch ended. Too involved. Involved in what? After that, Elena was everywhere. Passing me in the hall, sitting across the table in meetings, appearing suddenly at the end of aisles. Her gaze flicking to me, always too quickly to confront, never long enough to prove. A presence like static electricity, brushing close, never touching. Sometimes I'd look up and see her just standing there, watching, then vanishing around a corner. The tension coiled in me tighter each day. One Friday night I stayed late. The office was nearly empty, humming with the low thrum of machines. The fluorescent lights had dimmed into energy-saving mode, half the space cloaked in shadows. As I walked toward the break room, I saw her, alone at the table, a notebook open, scribbling furiously. When she realized I was there, she slammed it shut, eyes wide, face flushing. "Hi," she said too brightly. I mumbled something, retreated. My pulse didn't slow until I was back at my desk. On Monday, her desk was empty. By Tuesday, still empty. By Wednesday, it looked abandoned. Papers scattered, coffee cups ringed with stains, and then I saw them. A pile of handwritten notes spilling across the desk. I shouldn't have looked. I knew I shouldn't, but my eyes snagged on the repetition. My name, over and over. Daniel, I'm sorry. Daniel, I had to. Daniel, Daniel, Daniel. My hand shook as I picked one up. I took it straight to my manager. He frowned, sighed. She quit this morning. Emailed HR. Said she needed to leave for personal reasons, just like that, gone but not gone. That night I was brushing my teeth when I heard it. A whisper. Faint. Outside my apartment door. I froze. Toothbrush dangling. Slowly I walked to the peephole. Elena stood there, her face pale, lips moving, eyes locked forward. I couldn't hear the words, but I knew. My name, over and over, my chest seized. I staggered back, grabbed my phone, dialed 911. By the time I looked again, she was gone. The cops came, searched the hall, the stairwell, the street. Nothing. One of them shrugged. If she shows up again, call us. But she hasn't committed a crime. I barely slept that night. Days blurred. Weeks. Then came the email from building management. Residents were warned. A woman had tried to enter the building. Security stopped her. She said she wanted to apologize to someone. Me. I knew it was me. After that, smaller things began. Footsteps in the hallway when I got home late. Phone calls where no one spoke. Shadows outside the lobby window that vanished when I turned my head. Kara left not long after. Said she couldn't live with the tension. Said I wasn't myself anymore. She was right, and then suddenly it stopped. No whispers. No footsteps. No shadows. Elena vanished from my days as abruptly as she had entered them. For 3 years, silence. But silence doesn't heal. It festers. Even now, I'll be walking down a crowded street and a glimpse of dark hair will make my stomach drop. A voice behind me in the grocery store will sound too close to hers. I tell myself she moved on. Found someone else to fixate on. But sometimes, on nights when the building is quiet, when the city outside is muffled and still, I hear it. A whisper by my door. My name, and I know. She never left.